In the grand sweep of history, the Roman Empire stood as an unstoppable force. From the misty highlands of Britain to the sun-scorched sands of North Africa, Rome extended its reach with ruthless efficiency. Its legions, disciplined, battle-hardened, and supremely organized, were a war machine unlike any the world had seen before. To defy Rome was to invite annihilation. Entire kingdoms crumbled before their banners, entire cultures erased, and countless strongholds reduced to rubble beneath the thunder of siege engines. Rome was power incarnate, and resistance, for most, was a death sentence. And yet, hidden on the edges of this empire, there stood a fortress that dared to resist. A bastion so resilient, so cunningly defended, that even Rome's vaunted legions could not break it. To the Romans, it was a humiliating blemish on their record of conquest. To those who lived within its walls, it was a sanctuary, a symbol of defiance, freedom, and the refusal to kneel before the world's greatest power. For modern audiences, it is a forgotten chapter in history, a story buried in the ruins of empire, waiting to be rediscovered. This is where our journey begins, not in the gilded halls of emperors, nor in the triumphant parades of victorious generals, but in the shadows cast by an outpost that Rome could not tame. To appreciate the magnitude of what this fortress achieved, one must first understand the sheer weight of what it opposed. Rome's legions were not just soldiers, they were a living embodiment of discipline and innovation. Every man carried a shield and short sword, trained to fight in perfect cohesion. Every legion marched with its own engineers, surveyors, and siege specialists, capable of building bridges, roads, and entire camps overnight. When Rome marched to war, it carried the full might of civilization with it, a civilization that prided itself on bending nature itself to its will. To most ancient peoples, the sight of those standards glinting on the horizon was enough to break resistance before the first arrow flew. Fortress walls that had stood for generations were smashed apart by Rome's siege engines. Cities that had defied other enemies found themselves engulfed in fire and ruin once Rome arrived. This reputation was not myth, it was earned, paid for in blood and stone. And yet, somehow, against all odds, there was a place that Rome could not conquer. A stronghold that stood in stubborn defiance, its walls unyielding, its people unwavering. The story of this fortress challenges the very narrative of Roman invincibility. It reminds us that even the most powerful empires encounter limits, that arrogance can falter before determination, and that the human spirit is often the strongest weapon of all. But what was this fortress? Was it merely stone and mortar, or something greater? Was it defined by its walls, or by the people who chose to defend them? To Rome, it may have seemed like an insignificant thorn in the flesh, a remote outpost unworthy of grand attention. Yet the very fact that it resisted, that it endured where so many others fell, transformed it into a symbol. For the defenders, survival was not just a matter of pride, it was existence itself. To surrender meant enslavement, exile, or extermination. To hold their ground was to protect their families, their culture, their identity. And in choosing to fight, they etched themselves into the fabric of history, even if later centuries nearly forgot their names. The emotional pull of this story lies in its paradox. Rome was a titan, and yet even titans stumble. The fortress in the shadows serves as a reminder that power, no matter how vast, is never absolute. For the viewer, this is a chance to witness a rare crack in the armor of the empire, a moment where history did not follow the script of conquest and submission, but instead veered into the unexpected. Our documentary will peel back the layers of this forgotten tale. We will step onto the frontier where Rome's reach began to falter, examine the stones of the fortress itself, and uncover the lives of those who chose defiance over surrender. We will explore the strategies of the Roman commanders who tried to break it, and the ingenuity of the defenders who refused to yield. This is not just a story about wars and battles. It is about the collision between empire and independence, between overwhelming force and unyielding spirit. It is about the choices people make when standing at the edge of history, with annihilation on one side and freedom on the other. As we move forward, we will travel into the very landscape that shaped this struggle, a land on the edge of empire, where Rome's legions marched with confidence, only to discover that victory was not guaranteed. The shadow of the fortress looms large, and the story of its defiance is only just beginning. To understand the defiance of the fortress, we must first step beyond its walls, into the rugged land that shaped its very existence. This was no ordinary province of Rome, no well-paved colony dotted with marble forums and aqueducts. It was a frontier, a harsh borderland at the edge of empire, where the ambitions of Rome collided with the fierce independence of native peoples who had lived there for centuries. Rome always hungered for expansion. Conquest was not merely a military act, it was the lifeblood of the empire. New provinces brought wealth, resources, taxes, and slaves. For emperors and generals, victories on distant frontiers were the currency of power. But expansion carried risks. Each frontier was a place where Rome's reach was tested, where terrain, climate, and culture often fought against Roman order. And in this particular land, Rome discovered a challenge far more stubborn than it anticipated. The region surrounding the fortress was defined by its unforgiving geography. Towering mountains, thick forests, or barren deserts, whatever form it took, the land itself conspired against invaders. Roman legions thrived on open battlefields, where their formations could dominate, where their discipline turned chaos into precision. But here, the terrain fractured their lines, slowed their marches, and sapped their morale. Roads were few, rivers unpredictable, and weather often merciless. Supply lines stretched thin, vulnerable to ambush. For every mile the Romans advanced, the land punished them. Yet geography was only half the story. The people of this frontier were not easily broken. They were warriors forged by hardship, raised in a world where survival required resilience. Their identities were tied to their land in ways the Romans could scarcely understand. To these tribes or communities, resisting Rome was not a choice, it was destiny. The empire might have brought the promise of order, prosperity, and Roman citizenship, but it also demanded submission, taxes, and cultural erasure. For proud peoples, that was a price too high to pay. These communities did not fight Rome with the same weapons or the same tactics. They fought with cunning, mobility, and intimate knowledge of their homeland. They struck supply lines in the dead of night, vanished into forests or hills, and harassed the legions with relentless skirmishes. To the Romans, such tactics were dishonorable, barbaric even. To the defenders, it was survival, the only way to match an enemy that seemed otherwise invincible. It was in this volatile environment that the fortress became more than stone, it became a symbol of unity. While the frontier tribes might squabble among themselves in times of peace, the presence of Rome often forced them together. The fortress stood as a rallying point, a place where resistance could be organized, where hope could be anchored. Its very location was no accident. Built at a strategic crossroads, perhaps overlooking a valley, guarding a mountain pass, or perched upon a high plateau, it served as both shield and beacon. Rome could march around it, but it could never truly ignore it. For the Romans, conquering this land was as much about pride as strategy. To leave such a fortress standing was to admit that their empire had limits, that their legions could be checked. And so Rome returned again and again, determined to break it, to prove that no corner of the world was beyond their grasp. But with every failed attempt, the legend of the fortress grew. This section of the story is the classic clash of opposites, the empire of order versus the chaos of the frontier, the drilled discipline of legionaries against the fluid resistance of locals who knew every rock, tree, and hidden path. It was a contest not just of arms, but of wills. The defenders fought for survival, the Romans for dominance, and in that collision, the stage was set for one of history's most remarkable standoffs. As the camera lingers on maps and landscapes, on ruins and reconstructions, the audience begins to feel the weight of inevitability. Rome will come. The legions will march. And the fortress will face the storm. But now, armed with the knowledge of this land and its people, we understand that this was never going to be a simple conquest. This was going to be a test of endurance, ingenuity, and sheer determination. The story now shifts inward, from the land itself to the beating heart of the stronghold. We will step through its gates, examine its stones, and uncover the genius of its design. For the next chapter belongs to the fortress itself, an edifice that would defy the greatest army the ancient world had ever seen. The fortress rises from the landscape like a defiant scar, its stones weathered but unbroken, its silhouette etched against the horizon as if daring the world to challenge it. To outsiders, it may have looked like just another stronghold, one of countless fortifications scattered across the ancient world. But to those who lived behind its walls, and to the Romans who tried to storm them, this fortress was unlike any other. Its strength lay not only in stone and mortar, but in the genius of its design, the cunning of its defenders, and the sheer will that animated its defenses. Every fortress tells a story through its architecture. The builders of this one understood the art of survival. Its walls were thick, often layered with stone and earth to absorb the pounding of Roman siege engines. Towers crowned the corners, giving defenders clear vantage points to rain arrows and stones upon attackers. Narrow gateways, reinforced with iron and angled to funnel enemies into kill zones, turned any breach into a death trap. The Romans prided themselves on their siegecraft, but here they met a structure that anticipated their every move. The heart of the fortress was more than just walls, it was preparation. Vast storage chambers were carved deep within, filled with grain, dried meat, oil, and water. Cisterns collected rainfall, ensuring that thirst could not drive surrender. Hidden passages, carved into rock or masked by clever construction, allowed for sudden sallies or secret escapes. Where Rome relied on overwhelming force, the fortress relied on patience. It was designed not merely to withstand an assault, but to endure the long, suffocating pressure of siege. Inside, life carried on with a rhythm forged by necessity. Families huddled in cramped quarters, children grew up in the shadow of battlements, and warriors stood watch day and night. For them, the fortress was not only a defensive structure but a community, a living organism built around defiance. The defenders were not nameless soldiers. They were fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters, all bound by the knowledge that the fortress was their last line of survival. The clash between fortress and legion was also a clash of philosophies. The Romans believed no wall was unconquerable. They brought with them siege towers that loomed higher than ramparts, battering rams to smash through gates, and disciplined engineers capable of constructing ramps and trenches with terrifying speed. Against such might, most strongholds fell within weeks. But this fortress had been built with Roman methods in mind. Its defenders knew the tactics of the empire, and they turned that knowledge into armor. Every rampart was angled to deflect, every tower positioned to counter, every hidden passage designed to outmaneuver. For the Romans, who measured progress in conquests, this stronghold was an infuriating riddle. For the defenders, it was a lifeline, a place where determination could outlast arrogance. The emotional resonance of the fortress lies in its symbolism. It was never meant to be the largest or most opulent, but it became legendary because it endured. Its walls carried the memory of every arrow loosed, every stone hurled, every shout of defiance that echoed across its battlements. As the camera lingers on reconstructed walls and imagined battle scenes, the audience feels the weight of anticipation. The fortress stands ready, its defenses tested, its people resolved. But the Roman standards are already appearing on the horizon. The legions are coming, their drums echoing through the valleys, their siege engines rolling forward. The defenders retreat behind their gates, tightening their grips on spear and bow. The storm is about to break, and the fortress will face the greatest trial of its existence. The fortress stood silent as the first Roman scouts appeared on the ridgelines. Dust rose in the distance, a brown haze shimmering under the sun, signaling the approach of Rome's finest. To the defenders behind the walls, the sight was terrifying yet inevitable. They had heard the stories, the endless columns of disciplined legionaries, the glint of armor, the banners carried aloft like symbols of fate itself. Now, those stories were no longer tales of distant lands. Rome had come for them. The legions advanced with the precision of a machine. Every camp was laid out in perfect order, trenches dug, ramparts raised. The Romans did not simply arrive, they reshaped the landscape into a war engine. From their fortified camps, they built roads leading directly toward the fortress, ensuring that supply lines flowed without interruption. Siege engineers scouted the walls, measuring angles, noting weaknesses, planning where towers and rams could strike. For the defenders, it must have felt as though the earth itself was turning against them, molded by Roman will. Inside the fortress, tension grew thick. The gates were barred, supplies rationed, weapons sharpened. Every man, woman, and child knew what was at stake. To surrender meant chains, or worse. To resist meant hardship, hunger, and blood. Yet there was no question. The fortress was their home, their identity, their last refuge. Fear mixed with determination, and the defenders prepared to endure what could become months of relentless pressure. The first days of the siege were a contest of nerves. Roman horns sounded across the valleys as test assaults probed the defenses. Lines of legionaries advanced behind shields, only to be showered with arrows, stones, and boiling pitch hurled from above. Siege towers creaked forward, but defenders set them aflame with fire-tipped missiles. Each Roman attempt was met with equal cunning from those behind the walls. For every move, there was a counter. For every breach attempted, there was a desperate stand. The fortress seemed to defy the very logic of Roman warfare. These were soldiers who had crushed Carthage, who had stormed Jerusalem, who had ground entire tribes into dust. Yet here, against a fortress built by those the empire dismissed as lesser, they found themselves stymied. Days turned into weeks, and frustration crept into the Roman ranks. The summer sun scorched them by day, while chilling winds gnawed at them by night. Supplies grew strained as wagons struggled along dangerous routes, harried by ambushes from local fighters who struck and vanished into the hills. Psychological warfare became another weapon. Roman commanders ordered prisoners executed within sight of the walls, hoping to break morale. Siege engines hurled not just stones, but corpses and flaming debris, turning the air into a storm of terror. Yet the defenders answered with their own defiance, shouts of mockery, counterfires, and relentless resistance. What Rome sought to make an example of instead became a stage for stubborn pride. Every siege is a test of endurance, not only of armies but of spirit. Inside the fortress, the people endured hunger, exhaustion, and the constant thrum of fear. Children cried in the dark, elders whispered prayers, and warriors stood sleepless, staring into the torchlit night where Roman patrols prowled. And yet, for all the hardship, the walls still held. For the Romans, each day without victory was a wound to their pride. They were not used to stalemate. Their tactics were designed for efficiency: overwhelm, crush, move on. But here, efficiency met a wall of determination, and efficiency began to falter. Reports of failure reached commanders' ears. Officers argued over whether to intensify assaults or starve the defenders into submission. The longer the siege dragged on, the more the balance of power shifted, not because the fortress grew stronger, but because Rome's invincibility began to crack. The emotional tension of this chapter lies in the slow unraveling of certainty. For the defenders, every day survived was a triumph, proof that Rome could be resisted. For the legionaries, every failed assault was a reminder that even the greatest empire could stumble. Siege warfare was as much about perception as it was about walls, and this fortress was teaching Rome a humiliating lesson: conquest was not guaranteed. As the sun set on yet another day of frustration, the drums of Rome fell silent. Smoke rose from smoldering siege engines, and the fortress still stood. The defenders, battered but unbroken, looked out over the battlefield with weary eyes and unyielding resolve. The siege was far from over, but the tide of confidence had begun to shift. And soon, the true breaking point would arrive, not for the defenders, but for Rome itself. The siege dragged on, and what Rome had expected to be a swift demonstration of its power had become a grinding humiliation. The fortress still loomed above the battlefield, its walls blackened by fire but unbreached, its defenders weary yet unbowed. For every day that passed, the legend of the stronghold grew, and with it, the cracks in Rome's pride began to widen. Legionaries who once marched with confidence now muttered in frustration. The endless rhythm of failed assaults wore down their morale. Disease crept through the camps, spreading in the cramped tents where soldiers slept on damp ground. Supplies dwindled as local fighters cut off convoys, striking with ambushes before melting into the hills. What had begun as a display of Roman dominance was turning into a quagmire that drained both resources and reputation. The commanders faced a bitter choice. They could continue hurling men and machines against the fortress, losing lives and face with every failed attempt, or they could withdraw, admitting that Rome had been denied. To retreat was to risk dishonor, a stain that could follow generals back to the Senate and whisper through the corridors of power. But to remain was to bleed slowly, trapped in a struggle that had no end in sight. Inside the fortress, The defenders clung to survival with the desperation of those who had nothing left to lose. Food was scarce, thirst gnawed at their throats, yet the sight of the enemy faltering gave them strength. They had withstood Rome's might, not by overpowering it, but by outlasting it. Every arrow fired, every stone hurled, every night survived was proof that the empire was not invincible. And then, the moment came. Whether by a decisive ambush, a devastating storm that wrecked siege engines, or the sheer exhaustion of Rome's legions, the tide finally turned. The Romans began to pull back. Their siege camps, once buzzing with the confidence of conquest, now smoldered with frustration. Standards lowered, engines abandoned, the proud columns of soldiers turned away from the walls they had sworn to break. The fortress had not only survived, it had broken the will of the greatest army in the ancient world. For the defenders, the sight was almost surreal. The empire that had crushed so many others was retreating, humbled by a single stronghold. Tears of relief mingled with cries of triumph as the gates opened and survivors looked out upon a battlefield littered with the remnants of Roman arrogance. They had endured hunger, fear, and death, but in the end, they had won something more powerful than victory. They had won time, dignity, and legend. This was not the kind of victory sung in Rome's triumphal parades. It was a scar, a reminder that even the mightiest empire could be resisted. The fortress became more than stone. It became a story carried through generations, a tale of how ordinary people could stand against the unstoppable and prevail. For Rome, the defeat was a bitter lesson. The empire would continue to expand, its legions would march on to conquer new lands, but this single failure lingered like a shadow. The fortress had reminded the world, and Rome itself, that even empires have limits. The smoke of the siege eventually faded, and the clash of steel gave way to silence. Yet the memory of the fortress endured, etched into the minds of both those who had defended it and those who had failed to conquer it. For the Romans, it was an unwelcome reminder that their empire, vast and powerful though it was not limitless. For the people within its walls, it became a story to be told and retold, a legacy of survival against impossible odds. In Rome's official records, such defeats were often minimized or buried. Emperors preferred to speak of triumphs, of lands subdued and peoples brought under the eagle's wings. But history, like stone, preserves its scars. Archaeological traces, local legends, and whispered tales carried the story of the fortress through time. Scholars piecing together fragments centuries later would find not just the remnants of walls, but the echoes of a struggle that spoke of resilience in the face of overwhelming force. The fortress became a symbol greater than itself. It represented the idea that no empire, no matter how mighty, could claim absolute dominion. Every wall that resisted, every people that refused to bow, revealed the cracks in imperial arrogance. For the communities of the frontier, the fortress was a reminder that their culture, their independence, and their will to fight mattered, even against the seemingly unstoppable. And in this lies the deeper lesson. History often celebrates the victors, enshrining their conquests as destiny fulfilled. Yet the fortress that defied Rome tells us something different, that endurance itself can be a kind of victory. Though the empire marched on, conquering elsewhere, this single stand forced it to reckon with its limits. In the annals of resistance, such stories shine as brightly as any triumphal procession. For us today, the ruins of that fortress invite reflection. We see in its stones not only the scars of war, but the stubborn determination of human beings who chose defiance over surrender. Its legacy reminds us that power is never absolute, and that even the greatest forces in history can be challenged by the courage of the few. As the camera pulls back from the crumbling walls and the winds sweep across the landscape, one final question lingers. If Rome, the mightiest empire of the ancient world, could not conquer everywhere, how many other forgotten strongholds lie hidden in the shadows of history, waiting for their stories to be told?